And again, being an educational interpreter is an enormous responsibility, more than working with hearing children, really. And some parents do a wonderful job of accepting their role and taking it seriously, but many do not, meaning that load and that responsibility ends up going to you. So, with reading skills, literacy skills, language development, world knowledge, the deaf miss a lot of that information about how the world operates and how it works, about culture, American culture, other cultures, deaf culture, what have you. And they don't know how to think. Many deaf have a hard time thinking for themselves, which is connected to language, their language deprivation. So, as educational interpreters, you have an enormous responsibility, and you can't solve everything, but you just do the best you can. And there's still a lot of resistance to ASL, that it's bad English or it's bad for lip reading, bad overall. But really, the more skills and the earlier a start a deaf child has, the better. The more access to information and knowledge and language. I'm not saying that ASL is the only correct way for all deaf children. I've seen successes in other ways with signed exact English, lip reading, etc. But I've seen it, but not enough success. Not enough, truly. The more skills deaf children have with ASL, the better communicator they will be. Knowledge of a first language is related to their culture. Language is related to culture. Where does ASL come from? From deaf people. It's an organic language, like any other language should be. It's from the community that uses it, and it's the best system that works for deaf people. It is the best way for deaf people to communicate. And so you see a lot of that resistance. Really, we need to get rid of that. I'm not saying that we need to stop using signed exact English and other methods. We just need to add ASL to the equation. It is a very powerful language. It is a visual language. So if you have a strong first language, it doesn't matter which language that is, it helps with everything else, with English, but you have to have a very strong first language. And for some deaf kids, they can become competent in English as a first language. We've seen that, and that's fine. But for most and for other deaf kids, they struggle for different reasons with English. They cannot coordinate English as a strong first language, or they cannot incorporate it. It's difficult. ASL, however, is better for those kids. It is a bridge for them to later learn English skills. Reading is only one important key for language development. If you're signing a story and the child doesn't enjoy the story, they're not going to be motivated to read. It's important that they enjoy the story, enjoy understanding the story, and then they'll want to know more about books and they'll want to read more and more. And then they will improve their English literacy skills. But signing must come first for that to happen. Now, ASL can serve as a link for English development and language development in general. And we know that from seeing examples from children from deaf families. They do better overall. They do really well with language, with English, with ASL, with world knowledge, with critical thinking skills. So from that group of children, children raised in deaf families, we can learn a lot. So the bilingual philosophy is being more and more researched to help us really understand not just ASL and English, but spoken languages such as Spanish, how successful those bilingual children can be. And ASL is also a very ASL is a very visual language. And to me, that's the marker that makes it great for deaf children. And it really makes the most sense for deaf people. Signed exact English sometimes does not make sense to deaf people. It's confusing. If you already have mastered English, if you haven't already mastered English, it's very confusing. If you have, it will make sense to you, signed exact English. And it'll just look like maybe funny signs, depending on the child. So signing ASL and ASL does not necessarily mean a child will be competent in English. Something has to be cultivated and happen to make a bridge between ASL and English. It's not a simple, like, oh, well, if a child's signing ASL, they're automatically going to be good in English. No, there's a lot involved. There's a lot of learning, but there's good news. More and more reachers now is giving us an idea of how that bridge happens. And I'm going to share some of how that happens with you right now. What you can do to make sense of books for deaf children and increase their English literacy. There's a link between signing and fingerspelling in English. For so it's kind of like an octopus in that story. There was a woman who was an orphan, didn't have a mother, didn't have a father. She was an adopted. She was adopted. So for example, the word octopus. There was a girl who was an orphan. She had no parents. So she had to be taught the English word and it had to be expanded for her so that she could understand it. And she made gradual links to the English language. If you sign and they don't have the links to relate to the word, it's not going to be beneficial for them. And it's not going to help with their English literacy. So information really needs to be things need to be clear for deaf children and very explicit. It is very important and it's very important in deaf culture. If you haven't noticed, deaf people tend to tell you things more clearly and explicitly and profoundly. And hearing people might consider it to be a little bit TMI. But to us, it's not enough information. We want more. We want more. We always want more. We want explanations. We want to know why. It's important part of our culture and a part of our experience as deaf people. Some English words have many different meanings. And if you use the same sign for that same English word with different meanings, it can be very confusing. And by the same token, ASL has some signs that have many meanings. It doesn't just go one way, it goes both ways. For example, old sign for family. It means it has many different meanings, and it's changed to be all of these signs, and so it's not just one sign anymore. It's nice, but is that really ASL? No, we tend to fingerspell those words rather than having different signs for them for clarification. So every language has its own limits and its own strengths. Are you ready to dive in to storytelling? There are different techniques to teaching children to reading stories to deaf children. So we'll focus on storytelling and then we'll focus on story reading, which are different skills. ASL is a huge part of deaf culture because it is how we share stories with each other. How life in the hearing world works, about our parents, about school. Deaf people share their lives with each other through stories, through language. It's very important. We're not getting it from our parents, most of us. They're not deaf. So we have to share with each other a lot of stories about our lives so we can learn from each other about technologies and solutions to the obstacles we face. It used to be a lot easier for deaf children because they used to all go to deaf school, but today that's not the case. So where are deaf children going to get stories from? They used to go to deaf school and meet deaf adults, older deaf kids that she would share with them and teach them life skills, teach them language, teach them how to think, and challenge them. Just like in any community, not just the deaf community. The deaf children learn all that from family, neighbor, or children learn from family, neighbors in general. And deaf children used to have that in the deaf schools or residential schools. So deaf children need stories more than ever since most do not any longer go to the residential schools for the deaf. So you need to share your stories with them. I have one example to share with you. I'm divorced. I teach in college, and half the kids I teach are I'm divorced. I teach college classes, and half of the kids are hearing and might be taking deaf culture or deaf education. For many, it's their first time encountering a deaf person, is encountering me. So I also teach deaf students, and I've had maybe 100 deaf kids go through my program. And since in 23 years of teaching, not one hearing student has asked me why I'm divorced. Not one. Never. In the 23 years I've been teaching, maybe 5 deaf have asked me. Most don't, but 5 did ask me. So, so when they do ask you that, don't tell them, they ask you questions like that. Don't say to them, it's none of your business. That's rude. Don't ask people questions like that. when they do ask me those questions, what they really are meaning to say is, why do people get divorced in general? Maybe their own parents are divorced. Maybe their mom just kind of gestured in a very rudimentary way that they were getting divorced. They didn't love each other anymore, and daddy's going bye bye. The deaf child wants out more information than that. Why are their parents divorcing? They have no idea. And they see me and they think I'm a nice man, I'm open, and so they come and they ask me, as them thinking of me as a nice man, why are you divorced? So they could perhaps get a better understanding of why their own parents are divorced. Now, obviously, I say to them, it's all my ex-wife's fault. It was 99.9% her fault and only 0.1% my fault. I'm an angel. No, I'm just kidding. I don't tell them that. I tell them marriage is hard. We each have our own backgrounds and way of life and doing things. Perhaps one spouse likes to save money, and I like to spend lots of money. Maybe one likes to go to bed early at 10 o'clock, and I want to watch TV all night long. She likes to keep the house very neat and orderly, but I'm very laid back about that. Who's right and who's wrong? That's what the deaf students really wanted to know from me. And they would tell me thank you when I would explain those things. Those stories are immensely important for deaf children and deaf people. They want to know why things happen. They want more information. In the deaf schools, the residential schools, they got lots of stories, but now they're lost. They have almost no one. So if a deaf child asks you, why are you divorced? Don't tell them that's not nice to ask questions like that. Explain to them why people divorce in general, and explain most of the time it's not good to ask people that. For me, it's okay, but you shouldn't go asking everyone around why they're divorced. And that's a good lesson for them. So they can learn why people get divorced and that they also shouldn't ask everybody. Don't tell them it's none of your business. Say, well, if they ask you, for example, also, how much money do you earn? Don't tell them that's none of your business. Tell them, explain it to them. They want that information. It's not about you, it's about information in general. So become comfortable sharing with them. TMI.